Well, the Liberal government, the Tories, they've been going at it all week over ethics-related controversies facing Finance Minister Bill Morneau.
If the members opposite have something they want to say, they should say it here, say it now clearly, and in the foyer.
So how is it that the Prime Minister is able to blindly trust someone who has demonstrated such ethical lapses?
They now have nothing to do except make wild accusations and sling mud, because that's simply what they do.
All right, let's get some perspective on this and what next could be ahead for the finance minister, with the opposition calling for his resignation. Corporate governance expert Richard Leblanc joining us here in studio. Okay, you saw the fireworks there. What do you make of all this?
Well, it's a bit of a slow-moving train wreck. There is obviously a conflict of interest, and I think it's important to establish context and the facts. The Ethics Commissioner never should have allowed a finance minister to own shares, directly or indirectly, in a public company. That was incorrect from the get-go. And then we have, in late 2015, the finance minister introducing legislation, and a few weeks prior to that, someone, and we don't know who, sold a significant number of shares in the finance minister's publicly traded company. A few weeks later, legislation was introduced that resulted in overall share price drops. So the shares were sold immediately preceding the share price drop. And the opposition parties are asking, correctly, who owned the shares? Did Morneau own the shares? Did a family member, did an affiliate of Morneau own the shares? And neither Morneau or Trudeau are answering that fundamental question, which raises conflict of interest and integrity concerns.
Let's look at this a different way. Regardless of whether there's a conflict of interest or not, the more people talk about this and keep it in the narrative, this idea or this perception of a conflict of interest sort of stays in the limelight. So what happens given that? I mean, you called it a slow-moving train wreck.
Yeah. Well, it introduces distraction on the government, and Canada's doing very well in comparison to the G7. Our economic indicators are up, unemployment is down, and it limits the ability of the government to keep on message because it's continuously distracted by its finance minister. And of all ministers, this should be a minister, you think of John Flaherty, Paul Martin, Michael Wilson, just, you know, titans of stability and security and assurance with the capital markets. You don't want a minister of finance looking like a deer in the headlights. This is the only minister who has never had political experience prior to coming into office. You know, even if the ethics commissioner said it's okay to own shares, a good politician would say, listen, this is just does not pass the smell test. I'm going to engage in a blind trust or divest. And that didn't happen either. So it questions the judgment and credibility of a senior minister, the most important minister.
All right, so you mentioned a couple of past finance ministers, including Jim Flaherty, but let's just talk about what would happen if we were dealing with a company. And obviously, the finance minister used to run a publicly traded company.
Right.
You have this perception out there that there's an issue. Maybe there's somebody putting out there. Maybe it's not the opposition in Ottawa. Maybe it's some rival company or some analyst or some short seller that's targeting the company. From what you're saying, it sounds to me like you think this may stand in the way of the finance minister or the government to be able to do what is on their agenda.
That's right.
Have we seen situations in the corporate world where there is this cloud of controversy and literally the company is not able to push ahead with what it needs to until it deals with something, say, in the boardroom?
Well, in the corporate world, the laws are pretty clear. You, as a CEO, are a deemed insider. You have to only trade shares during blackout periods. There's complete disclosure of who owns the shares. When you get to the public world, it seems to be opaque. We really need to improve laws in Canada on politicians going into office and divesting or entering into a blind trust because of allegations, particularly ministers of finance. I mean, what they touch and what they introduce in the form of legislation affects capital markets broadly. So this would never occur in the corporate world, John, in answer to your question, because the laws are so restrictive. And in the public world, it seems that there's a slippery slope.
So when does one have to make a determination on whether or not there needs to be a change in leadership? I mean, ultimately, that's the Prime Minister's call.
Right.
And he certainly, to date, certainly within the last 24 hours, listen to what he's saying. He's standing by the finance minister.
Right. Cutting a Minister of Finance loose is very significant. It almost never happens. It should be done with great thought and care. The question for Trudeau and for the Liberal government is this going to continue? Mary Dawson, the Ethics Commissioner, has yet to rule on alleged conflicts of interest. And is this distraction so significant that it's compromising the government's agenda? Are you better off to cut this person loose and have a clean break and move on, or continue to weather the storm? And whether the storm's going to get worse or not. I think it's going to get worse.
Just to go to the other side and the opposition taking this easy opportunity to keep the narrative going here. What happens in the corporate world where someone is pushing for that change and maybe they are doing so unfairly so? And you know, is there a danger of the opposition pushing, you know, from their own leadership perspective, pushing and pushing and pushing on this if we're still a little cloudy on what ultimately went on here?
Well, there's very little tolerance now in the corporate world for reputational contagion and for adverse events like this.
Because the finance minister obviously is very frustrated and has threatened to sue if they keep this.
Well, I mean, when you threaten to sue, that's a sign that you don't have a winning argument. That almost never happens. And it's, you know, politics is about the public trust. It's about freedom of speech. It's not about, you know, making allegations of lawsuits. The finance minister needs to come square with the Canadian public. Did you or did you not own the shares? And if you didn't own them, then who owned them? So the opposition, I think, has a point of conflicts of interest. It's an issue going into public life. It should not be for self-enrichment. I'm not suggesting it is. It should be public trust. And the way you handle a conflict is full, true, and plain disclosure. And neither Trudeau nor Morneau are doing that. So this will not go away. There are more shoes to drop, and the decision needs to be made. Are we going to hang on to the minister, or are we not going to hang on?
All right, Richard, thanks for stopping by.
My pleasure, John.
Richard Leblanc, corporate governance expert at York University, joining us here in studio.